In a time of fake news, sloppy reporting, where members of the media are accused of sexual assault, political bias, and spewing corporate propaganda, why should journalists care about ethics? This particular question is found at the intersection of two different disciplines. It's found at the intersection of journalism or people in the media and what professional ethicists do or ethical treatises. So it's helpful to get clear about what journalists are up to and then what ethics is about to get clear about what this question involves. Journalism or the media is concerned with or is occupied by a variety of different topics. They're concerned with writing articles, presenting information, evaluating sources, and a number of other activities associated with presentation of information to the public. Most people are pretty familiar with the entities that produce media. These are the CNNs, the ABCs, the New York Times, the Foxes, the NBCs of the world. These media entities distribute news or information in 5 principal ways. One way is through television, for example, a nightly news show. A second way is through digital videos that are distributed either through the media group's website or through something like YouTube. A third example would be text articles that are distributed through a website. A fourth would be just a paper like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. And then the fifth would be through their social media accounts, for example, updating their viewership through Twitter. Another medium that I didn't really consider is radio, AM, FM radio. Sometimes people obtain news by listening while they drive, or I guess to a much lesser extent while they're sitting at home.
It's like a welcome knock on the door and the sound of the familiar voice of an old friend.
So there's a number of groups that don't clearly fall into the category of being part of the media. Hosts of talk shows like tabloid shows like Jerry Springer or Maury Povich, these individuals are clearly in the entertainment business. Their focus is not on really being reliable in terms of their guests or presenting information adequately, but instead shocking you or entertaining you. In talking about the media, I'm not restricting myself to, let's say, the corporate-run media, the media that you'd find on TV, but this could also include any type of YouTube journalist who's presenting information about the day's events. One class of individuals that it's not really quite clear whether or not they fall into the media or not are talk show hosts, and in particular talk show hosts that rely upon the information in the world affairs and often critique the media's presentation of that information. Some individuals do it comedically, so they poke fun at the presentation of world leaders or they poke fun at the other media figures. It's not quite clear if these individuals fall into the category of the media or journalists or not, because their primary function is entertainment or comedy. But in being comedic, they also present information at the same time, and they do a lot of the similar activities that the media performs. And as a function, they actually provide a lot of people information about the world. People may no longer look to, let's say, the nightly news for their information about what's going on, but use these comedians or entertainment figures to get information about the world. The other area to look at is ethics. Ethics is a normative science, and it aims to tell you or distinguish good versus bad action. In talking about morally good or permissible actions, we need to distinguish what's moral from what is legal, because certainly the two concepts can come apart. There could be morally good or permissible actions that are nevertheless illegal. So what are some examples of morally good or at least morally permissible acts that are in at least some places illegal? 3 examples might be abortion, homosexual marriage, and marijuana usage. All 3 of these, at least in some places, are outlawed, but nevertheless, you could make a good argument that all 3 of them, abortion, homosexual marriage, and marijuana, are at least morally permissible. You haven't done something wrong in doing any of those 3 actions. On the other hand, some things can be morally evil, but nevertheless lawful. So an example might be sloth. Sitting around all day, doing nothing, being unproductive, might be considered to be a morally evil act, but nevertheless we lawfully permit it. Another example could be hate speech. Society might permit you to use hate speech, but nevertheless we might say that this is evil, an evil thing to do. You've done something morally wrong in uttering hate speech. In addition to distinguishing morality from legality, we also need to distinguish moral action from prudential action. Prudential action concerns the type of action that would make your life go better or worse.
This is the story of how people are, how they act with each other, how they are happy and contented or miserable and afraid.
So something that would be prudentially good or prudentially wise would make your life better, and something that's prudentially unwise would make your life go worse. So let's think of an example where something is morally good or permissible, but nevertheless is prudentially unwise. It's going to make your life worse off. So I'd say anytime you risk your life and are injured in the process to save someone else is a morally good action. You've saved someone else, so there's got to be a good action, right? But if you've hurt yourself in the process, this made your life worse off, assuming you don't get money or praise for your heroic deeds. So we have a morally good action, but a prudentially bad one. On the other hand, there are certainly morally evil actions that might be prudentially wise or good actions. It might make your life go better. If you knew you could rob someone and get away with it, well, this is definitely an evil act to undertake, but nevertheless, it benefits you. Now you have the property of someone else that you didn't have before, and you can use that to do things to make your life on the whole better. So ethicists are concerned with evaluating action from a moral or ethical perspective, and this evaluation should not be confused with evaluating it from a legal or prudential perspective. Let's look at the first reason why journalists should care about ethics. Journalists should care about ethics because the selection and presentation of news or information is already guided by moral ideas. And so a better understanding of ethics, or at least ethical issues as they are found in journalism, allows those in the media to be more reflective about what they do. So the example I want to look at is civil asset forfeiture. So civil asset forfeiture, as I'll understand it, is when the authorities, that is the police or the government, can seize your assets, some belongings or materials or cash that you have, because you are involved in or suspected of a particular crime. So the cops can take your money, take your assets, take your property, take your car, because they think that you're using that particular property to commit some type of crime. At first glance, you might say, well, what ground does the government have to take my money? It's my money. How can they just take it from me? Well, I think there's actually some good reasons for civil asset forfeiture. Let's say I have a bunch of drugs in my car and I'm driving around because I'm selling it across the country. Well, if the police pull me over for good reason, let's say I'm speeding and they find those drugs, well, now they're going to take those drugs away from me. So what were once my drugs now become the drugs of the police, and hopefully they dispose of them properly. Or let's say I've made a bunch of money from selling drugs. I have a drug empire and I have millions of dollars in the trunk of my car. Well, the government is going to say, you got that money illegally and we're going to take that away from you. Another example would be, let's say I'm running a fake ID ring, and so I have printers specifically used to create fake IDs so kids can buy cigarettes or alcohol or whatever they want. Well, the government is going to say, you're using this particular product to commit crimes, and so we're going to take those products from you because we want to stop you from committing crimes. Here's a more curious case. Let's say I have a truck that I use to transport food. It's designated and licensed to transport food and nothing else. But on the weekend, I'm using it to transport garbage or waste or something like that and dumping it in rivers or streams. Well, the government, again, the police are going to seize my truck. Hey, you cannot use this truck to do anything else other than transport food, the stuff people need to eat. You can't, on the weekend, throw trash in there and use it to transport trash. So civil asset forfeiture seems reasonable. People use material belongings to commit crimes, and we want to take away those belongings that allow them to commit crimes. In addition, individuals that articulate the need for civil asset forfeiture seem quite reasonable. Here's a 2018 example from Nashville Metro Police Captain Michael Alexander.
In essence, what this involves is our department working with DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, on large-scale drug cases that are long-term investigations that, quite frankly, involve a very large, significant amount of drugs that are destined for Nashville. So
this seems quite reasonable. Civil asset forfeiture is directed at these drug kingpins, not Joe or Sally who has a tiny bit of drugs on them.
So when we work those cases together, Obviously, Metro Police personnel are heavily involved in those efforts with those cases, and there's a Nashville connection to those cases.
Here again, there's more credibility lended towards civil asset forfeiture in that it's not a rogue police department simply seizing people's money or trucks or belongings, but it's done in connection with or collaboration with a federal or national case.
And so if that case ends up being adjudicated and money was seized that was directly tied to that drug trade in that specific case, then we will receive a small share of that money that was seized.
So we have a definition of civil asset forfeiture. We have, at least at the outset, a reasonable case for it. And now we can raise the question, how might a journalist look at cases involving civil asset forfeiture? Well, there looks like two general lenses we could look at it through. We could look at it in a neutral way, that is without any type of ethical considerations, no views for moral right and wrong. But on the other hand, we can look at it through an ethical lens, thinking about civil asset forfeiture in terms of moral right and wrong. There are cases, though, where civil asset forfeiture is abused, and we want to know about those cases. And we don't want to know about, let's say, one or two. We actually want to know about a general trend. Because if there are abuses concerning civil asset forfeiture, that something is going on that shouldn't be going on, then we want to be able to contact legislators or put pressure on police departments to fix those abuses. So one example of two journalists who uncovered some of these abuses are Jeff Brazil and Steve Barry. They both wrote for the Orlando Sentinel. Brazil and Barry wrote a series of articles on civil asset forfeiture in Volusia County, Florida. One article that they wrote was titled Tainted Cash or Easy Money. The article has two main parts. In the first part, they provide an overview of details of 262 cases of civil asset forfeiture. Second, they provide some case histories about specific people who had their property seized. So let's discuss each one of these parts in turn. With respect to the details of those 262 cases, for 199 out of 262 cases, so 3 out of 4, there were no charges filed. In only 4 cases did someone get all of their money back. 9 out of 10 seizures involved a minority, someone that is black or Hispanic.
Well, originally they started this profile stop, which was really racially motivated. So every black that was driving down the highway was subject to being stopped if he was between the age of 20 and 50 and was wearing gold or cowboy shoes.
Another kind of aspect that they point out is they note that the sheriff gets to keep all of the money from the seizure regardless of whether or not a crime was committed.
That money's being, the way it's wrapped, wrapped in denominations with rubber bands, that's drug money. Maybe 40,000, 50,000, something like that. Okay.
The deputies kept the cash and turned it over to their department.
So if your property was seized, but you weren't charged with a crime, the sheriff's department in Volusia County kept all of the money.
Very little of that has actually been returned to the individual.
There was no higher authority outside the sheriff's department to review to see if the seizures were legitimate or an abuse had taken place. And finally, one thing that Brazil and Barry note is that if you have your money seized, it's difficult for you to get it back. Because if you want to get your money back, then you need to go to court. And if you need to go to court, then you need to hire a lawyer. And sometimes it's just cheaper and less time consuming just to settle with the sheriff's department and say, well, okay, give me half of it back and you can keep the other half. And one of the interesting parts of this article by Brazil and Barry is they give you a number of specific cases where individuals had their things taken from them through civil asset forfeiture, and it didn't look like the individuals did anything wrong, and the justification given by the sheriff's department just looks absurd. So let's look at one particular example of this. The example I want to look at is one mentioned in the article. This man, Joseph Key, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he was a black Navy reservist from Georgia with no criminal record, claiming to drive into Miami because he's going to go to school there. He was pulled over for driving 6 miles per hour over the speed limit, and when they searched his car, what they found was his Navy uniform, because remember, he's a Navy reservist, and they also found $3,989 in cash. So what's the justification for seizing this particular? What's the justification for the suspicion that this $3,989 in cash is going to be used to buy drugs or sell drugs or something like that? The justification said by the officer is that Key's wrinkled and scuffed shoes are things no legitimate military man should allow. So I guess the officer thinks like, hey, this is kind of suspicious here. This individual has approximately $4,000 in cash, claims to be in the Navy, but no real Navy reservist would have a wrinkled uniform and scuffed shoes. The Brazil and Berry article also cite a number of other cases where the justification for civil asset forfeiture looks lacking. So in the case of Key, we saw that, hey, this individual just had a wrinkled uniform, and that is grounds for seizing this individual's money, even when they can prove their own innocence. In other cases that they cite, they say a person had too much or too little luggage. Sometimes they would say the people look nervous. Another justification is the individual had bills in denominations of 1, 5, 10, 20, 50, and 100. Well, that's kind of ridiculous, because if you have a sizable amount of money on you, let's say from gambling or from some completely legal activity, might have it in different denominations. So Brazil and Berry won the Pulitzer Prize for their work through the Orlando Sentinel for topics concerning the abuse of civil asset forfeiture. But the point I want to make is that it looks like the selection and the presentation of the material in their particular article, it reflects a kind of ethical concern. Their concern is with the abuses and preventing those abuses. And so the article presents information in a way of highlighting the case where this particular law goes awry. In other words, civil asset forfeiture is looked at by journalists, and these journalists in particular, through an ethical lens. This is not a legal lens. They don't discuss what is and is not legal or illegal, or a prudential lens. They don't talk about what may improve an individual's life or decrease it. Instead, the lens is particularly ethical. So it's worth highlighting at least 3 ways that the lens and presentation and selection of this article has this ethical perspective to it. It looks like a lot of these cases targeted minorities. There looks like to be a clear conflict of interest in terms of who gets to keep the money. It also reverses how we typically think about criminal activity. And individuals have to prove that they're innocent. And in flipping the onus on them to prove that they're innocent, it becomes costly for the individual to show that, hey, I got this money through legitimate means. Perhaps a 4th reason is that it is morally wrong to search people when there isn't reasonable suspicion that they have committed a crime. So this is the charge that the traffic stops are just a pretext for drug searches. That is, these traffic stops are an excuse to subject people to unreasonable searches, invade their privacy. This takes us back to our first reason for why journalists should be concerned with ethics. If having a moral lens lets you be a better journalist, then presumably developing or having a better moral lens would allow you to be even better journalist. The main objection, though, to this idea is that some journalists, we might say, just don't care about doing journalism in an ethical way. Being ethical isn't what motivates them to get into journalism, nor is it what helps shape how they craft their particular presentation or investigations. And so we might say that this reason why they should care about ethics is too limited. In short, the objection is if you don't care about doing good journalism, then you have no reason to care about ethics at all. Now, none of this is to say that learning more about ethics or moral good versus bad action is going to make you ethical. Certainly, if you're a moral monster, then studying ethics is just going to help you find a justification for your bad behavior. You'll be able to appeal to some ethical theory to demonstrate or show why your particular action is morally good versus morally evil. You might make the case that Brazil and Berry's work, while motivated by ethical goals, is itself an instance of unethical journalism. That is, their work takes an ethical perspective on the issue of civil asset forfeiture, but they employ an ends justifies the means approach to stop the practice of seizures. This is the view sort of put forward by Robert Vogel, the sheriff of Volusia County at the time and the target of much of Brazil and Berry's attacks. He contends that Brazil and Berry are wrong both in their use of statistics, their details of the case histories, and they simply ignored evidence that would undermine their view that civil asset forfeiture was morally wrong. Instead, Vogel claims that Brazil and Berry made up their mind on the immorality of civil asset forfeiture when searching for any information that would support this conclusion, and when it was unavailable, simply lied or distorted the truth. So really briefly here, Berry and Brazil claim that of the 262 cases they reviewed, 90% of those cases involved minorities, whereas Vogel claims that only 74% included minorities of those 262. But when you review a broader set of cases, that is, you look at more cases than Berry and Brazil did, you find that the percentage of minorities is actually much lower. Vogel doesn't say the exact percentage or how many more cases he looked at, he just says that it is. Berry and Brazil also claim that 63 of the 262 cases involved an arrest. And so Vogel claims that this was just wrong, it was straight false. The number was much higher, that 107 of those 262 cases involved an arrest. Vogel states, though, that even though individuals aren't always arrested, these cases involving seizures sometimes do play a role in a DEA case. In addition to the generalizations made by Berry and Brazil, Vogel also contests a lot of the details of the case histories. He says that the case histories made by Berry and Brazil are very misleading. They exclude a lot of important information that will cause the reader to draw a different conclusion concerning the justification of civil asset forfeiture. So in particular, I want to look at the case involving Joseph Key. So the claim is that Key was ordered to go to Miami by the Navy, but one of the things that was left out from the article, but Vogel mentions, was Key did not know where exactly he was supposed to go, what base he was supposed to attend. In addition, he also says that Key didn't have any luggage at all, so he was going down to Miami to Volusia County, but didn't have anything with him. And it wasn't the case that his uniform was wrinkled. Instead, it was stuffed in the corner of the truck. So this Navyman has his uniform just jammed in some corner. Is a little bit different, at least according to Vogel, than it just has a couple creases here and there in it that shouldn't be there. And finally, Vogel says that of all the money he had it in these $100 rolls, which Vogel says is associated with drug sales. This takes me to my second reason why the media should care about ethics, and that reason is that their very existence as the media depends upon behaving ethically. That's a pretty simple argument. If your very existence depends upon something, then you're going to be concerned with that thing. Let's say my existence depends upon eating and breathing. Well, I'm going to be concerned about finding food as well as having air around me. Let's look at the argument for this. The argument is that in order to exist as a member of the media, in order to be a journalist, you must actually fulfill, or at least try to fulfill, the functions of a journalist, or the function of the media. Some of those functions require a minimal commitment to certain ethical values. Things like honesty, objectivity, fairness, avoiding bias, communicating information that's relevant, and so forth. The exact list is up for debate, so we might say you need to be committed to at least some ethical value, not necessarily 15 or a specific set. The conclusion is that the very existence of the media thus depends upon a commitment to ethics, or a commitment to ethical values. So let's talk about this. So in order to be a journalist, to really be a part of the media and not just a pretender, not someone dressed up in a journalist outfit or not just a talking head, you actually need to be committed to certain ethical values. You can't actually do whatever you want, because if you don't even try to present information in a reliable, objective way, then looks like your goal is something altogether different. So you have to at least be committed to things like trying to be objective, present the news in an impartial way, doing your research, being reliable, not lying. But this idea is kind of strange. Like, how can the existence of something depend upon a commitment to ethical values? Well, it's important to qualify what is meant here. What we're saying is that not that a journalist no longer exists as a biological or physical entity. They don't just die from failing to be committed to ethics or being an amoral monster. Instead, we're saying that they're no longer a journalist. They're just pretending to be a journalist. So the idea here is that their existence as the media depends upon their fulfilling certain functions, and their failure to fulfill those functions nullifies their status as the media. So another way of thinking about it is you are, like one of the things that you are in addition to being human, you are what you do. So if the media only entertains, well, we would say that you aren't really a journalist, you're an entertainer. Or if you're constantly lying, then you're not a real journalist, you're just a liar. You're just telling me false information. Or if you spin, smear, distort for, I don't know, a corporation or a government, then we'd say, again, you're not a journalist. You're pretending to be a journalist, but you're just a vehicle of propaganda.
Millions of Americans staying at home or relying on Amazon.
So in order to exist as the media, one actually needs to fulfill the functions of the media. And these involve ethical values, honesty, impartiality, objectivity, and so forth. But let's get a little bit clearer about this. Suppose someone says, nah. In order to be a journalist or be a part of the media, you only need to claim to be doing journalism. And you only need to present the news and not be committed to ethical values at all. Or you just need people to believe you, who, whether or not you're actually committed to those ethical values, is unimportant. Isn't it sufficient that you claim to be a journalist in order to be a journalist, or people believe you to be a journalist in order for you to be a journalist? The answer looks like no. I mean, you can put an argument forward that the answer is no. Claiming to be a journalist or having people believe that you're a journalist is different from actually being a journalist or part of the media. And the idea here is that things can just be other than they seem, and people can pretend to be things that they're not. So an example would be like, let's say I dressed up like a police officer and went around arresting people. Well, those people that I arrest might actually believe I'm a police officer, and I might claim to be a police officer, but this doesn't make me a police officer. Another example would be friendship. Let's say I have an individual who I think is my friend. They're claiming to be my friend. I believe that they're my friend, but they lie behind my back. They're constantly backstabbing, and they're just using me for some particular purpose. Well, it seems natural to say that this person is just pretending to be my friend and not really my friend. And so the same can be applied to journalists. You need to fulfill the function or meet certain requirements in order to be a journalist. And insofar as you fail to do those, or your function is something different, you want to entertain or shock or titillate us or deceive us, insofar as those are your goals, then you're doing something different. You're just pretending to be a journalist and not actually being a journalist. So in short, the idea here is that if you want to actually exist as a member of the media, you actually have to be committed to certain ethical values. So let's look at a consequence of all this. One consequence that we might point to is that public trust in mass media has eroded over time, especially among young people. So Gallup polls taken over a period of time have shown that people's confidence in the media has decreased. In 1997, 53% of people said that they either had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in mass media. But by 2016, that number has gone down to 32%. So from 53% to 32%. So we might say, well, what could explain this? What could explain the fact that people no longer trust the media? It's not a big surprise. One thing that might cause you no longer to trust someone is they behave unethically. But not all unethical behaviors make us distrust someone. So let's look at one in particular. Let's take the moral rule that you should not lie. You should not intentionally deceive someone or say something that you know not to be true unless you have a seriously good reason. If the media would lie to us repeatedly, then we'd say, well, I'm not going to trust someone that constantly lies to me. My confidence in you is going to decrease based upon the fact that you keep lying to me. You're not telling me what you know to be true, or you're presenting information to me in a way that's deceptive, and so that's going to cause me to distrust you. So let's look at a case. One of the cases I want to look at involves General Motors, or GM, and NBC. And the case is called the Waiting to Explode case. Now, there's a lot of details associated with this case, so I'm going to kind of give an overview. In the early 1990s, a certain line of truck was made by General Motors, and it was suspected of being dangerous. The danger was associated with this fuel tank. So the fuel tank was located on the outside of the truck's frame, sometimes called the side saddle arrangement. The idea was that if you were driving along in your GM truck and you were hit from the side where the fuel tank is located, the fuel tank would crush, fuel would spit out, there would be a fire, and you'd be burned alive. So this is a horrific thing. So on the 24th of October 1992, NBC's Dateline hired Bruce Enns of the Institute for Safety Analysis to do a crash test roughly 20 miles west of Indianapolis on a country road. The steering wheel was tied in place, and several incendiary devices or igniters were placed underneath the GM truck. A Chevy Citation was pushed along the road 30 to 45 miles per hour and then hit the side of the GM truck. So fast forward to November 17th. Then Dateline NBC claimed that a specific General Motors pickup truck explodes upon collision. NBC supported this claim with footage of the GM truck fuel tank exploding or catching fire after a collision.
At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. According to our experts, the pressure of the collision and the crushing of the gas tank forced gasoline to spew from the gas cap. The fuel then erupted into flames when ignited by the impacting car's headlight.
After the footage aired, GM complained about the report and asked to examine the car. NBC said that, we don't have it anymore. But lucky for GM, there was firefighters at the test site and contacted GM. And GM was able to track down the truck and the owner of the truck from a junkyard. And what they found out was that the owner of the truck had lost the original gas cap to the truck itself. And he was using one that didn't fit, and he said he had to use some metal wire to rig it to the gas cap opening. GM would later find out a number of other features that were left out of the NBC airing. They found that the gas tank was actually overfilled and that there were igniters placed underneath the truck itself.
Of NBC's irresponsible conduct transmitted via the airwaves throughout this great nation in their November Dateline program. These were her words. At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. As I indicated to you, on January 15th, we received a tip from a journalist indicating that the tests had been rigged.
So their claim at least is that NBC was deceptive or straight up lied about this. They didn't tell you about the igniters, they didn't tell you about the gas cap, and they didn't tell you about overfilling the gas tank. Instead, they made it seem like the gas tank itself was punctured by the collision, and that is what caused the fire. NBC would later say that the explosion itself was staged, that they had placed an incendiary device underneath which caused the explosion, that they had overfilled the gas tank, used a different gas cap, and falsely claimed that the impact punctured the gas tank. The footage is actually kind of amusing, so I want to roll this last part because there's a sort of funny piece to it.
We acknowledge the placing of the incendiary devices under the truck was a bad idea from start to finish.
That's our new policy, and we'll be right back.
So it's strange that they would say that, this is our new policy not to use unscientific demonstrations that completely mislead the viewers. So the claim then is this, that repeated lies like this by, let's say, an entity like NBC would indicate that NBC itself is not a real media organization. They are not committed to the type of ethical value needed in order to be a journalist, which would be honesty. Now, one lie, this case of the crash test, wouldn't make them liars, but if they were to repeatedly do this, then we would say that there is a reason not to trust them at all. And this repeated lying would not only erode public trust, as we saw from the Gallup poll and people no longer trusting the media, but also would serve as a concrete sign that these individuals who are pretending and claiming to be journalists are not actually journalists. Instead, they're doing something different. Instead, they're trying to entertain or fearmonger, deceive us or shock us so we watch more or buy things from their advertisers. So again, the reason members of the media should care about ethics is because failure to care about ethics would mean their non-existence. So sketchy journalism can seem like a victimless crime. Journalists can defend ethically questionable actions by saying things like, I'm just the messenger or the conduit. I'm giving people what they want. I'm giving the public what they want to know. Or the public has a right to know things even if they're false. But certain actions committed by the media can be indefensible from an ethical point of view because some news reporting can actually lead to physical and psychological harm to other people. So the third reason I have for why journalists should care about ethics is that unethical journalism can harm physically or psychologically other people. And since journalists don't want to harm people, they should care about ethics. This gives us an indirect reason to care about ethics. The journalists don't directly care about being ethical, but they do care about not harming people. And so insofar as unethical behavior leads to harm to others, they have a reason to care about being ethical. This reason does make an assumption. The assumption is that journalists don't actually want to harm people. I think this is a reasonable assumption to make about journalists. Like, if we can't make this assumption, then the media is composed of sadists or moral monsters. And there may be some in there, but I think it would be wrong to characterize the whole or even the majority as not caring at all about human welfare. The crux of this reason depends upon showing how the media can actually harm people in a physical or psychological way. There's a general tendency to think, well, they're just words. All the media is doing is saying things. And so how can that actually harm anyone physically or psychologically?
I'm a man in my 60s. I grew up in a time where sticks and stones might break your bones, but words never hurt me.
To say sticks and stones may break my bones.
There are a number of examples we could look at, but the one I'm going to look at is the McMartin Preschool trial. The McMartin Preschool trial occurred in the 1980s. There are many things that can be said about the McMartin case, and some people really disagree about some of the fundamental facts of the case. So I'm going to try to keep it minimal, and I'm giving this case as a sort of illustration. I'm not necessarily wedded to all the details of this particular case. So the McMartin Preschool trial involved a charge directed at 7 individuals that worked in a daycare. The primary individual being charged was Raymond Buckey. These individuals worked at the McMartin Preschool, and they were charged with sexually abusing approximately 100 children over a span of 10 years. The length of the trial was very long. It lasted 6 years in the case of Raymond Buckey, and led to no convictions, and was the most expensive trial, $15 million, in American history. The media was criticized heavily for creating hysteria concerning the McMartin Preschool, as well as daycares around the country. Media reports gave unsubstantiated claims that children were being raped by devil worshippers, that there were blood sacrifices. That is, Raymond Buckey was sacrificing rabbits at the school.
Someone killed a horse in front of you?
Yeah.
Where?
That was at a farm. That was part of the scare tactics.
They claim that children were threatened with guns, that they coerced children to not tell the parents about what was going on at the daycare, because if they did, they would burn the parents alive. There were satanic rituals, that there were secret tunnels connected to this school.
And the tunnel went right on across, all the way over to this wall.
Kids talked about passageways under the school and rooms under the school.
That molestation of the children was photographed or even filmed. That children were driven or even flown to remote locations during the day, for example, the grocery store or the zoo, and in those locations they were molested, and that the McMartin School is part of a vast, convoluted network or a wider conspiracy involving child pornography at daycares across the country.
Do you know, altogether, including McMartin, how many schools in this area closed because of allegations of child abuse?
7.
And was anyone ever convicted?
No.
So the media reported these claims, but the charge was that many of these claims were not verified at all. In addition, 2 reporters, Wayne Satz of KABC and David Rosenzweig of the Los Angeles Times, had conflicts of interest in reporting these stories. Satz dated Key McFarland, who was the controversial interviewer who asked the children, and some people say coerced the children, into claiming that they were molested at the daycare. And Rosenzweig became engaged to one of the prosecutors of the trial. A chunk of the media coverage of the McMartin case was based upon unfounded rumor, the testimony of verifiably unreliable witnesses, as well as children whose testimony looks like it was coerced, as well as wild speculation. So what was the harm associated with the media coverage of this particular trial? Well, the first feature was that media concern with it and its reporting on sensational aspects of it caused a hysteria. And this hysteria led to the case being prosecuted on a greater scale than the evidence really permitted. So this is a harm kind of indirectly, because since it was so costly and time-consuming to prosecute this trial, those taxes could be used for other things that would promote human welfare. So if you need supplemental resources to get yourself back on your feet, or food for the hungry, or anything like that, that money has been redistributed towards prosecuting a particular trial, which is based on little evidence. The second feature, and I think maybe a more important one, is that the group that was perhaps most harmed by all this were the children. Media hysteria and coverage associated with this particular trial led parents to take their children to a particular institute where their child would be interviewed by individuals about sexual assault. The interviewing practices at this particular center were very controversial and based upon a theory that is not well regarded anymore. Essentially, the criticism of the interviewing practice was that the types of questions and the method of questioning led children to just make up that they had been sexually assaulted. So they involve a lot of leading questions and the repetition of questions until the children ultimately confessed, oh yes, I was sexually assaulted. So some people have criticized the fact that this created false memories of sexual assault, which can be arguably traumatizing to an individual. If you weren't sexually assaulted, but now you believe you're sexually assaulted, well, there's significant scars associated with this particular belief. The other group that was most harmed, besides maybe the children, were the defendants themselves. They were disgraced publicly, they were financially ruined, the daycare itself was burned down because people broke the windows and threw a Molotov cocktail in it. They received death threats regularly. And Ray Buckey, who was the primary defendant, spent 5 years of his life in jail. So our third reason is that unethical journalism can actually harm other individuals. And since we can claim that journalists don't actually want to harm people, they should care about ethics. They should have a commitment to certain ethical values that are associated with doing good journalism. In review, there are at least 3 reasons why journalists should care about ethics. First, it makes them a better journalist as it gives them a different perspective or lens by which to analyze information and understand world events. We saw this in the case of Brazil and Barry, who analyzed the case of civil asset forfeiture in an ethical way rather than a purely legal or prudential way. Second, the very existence of journalism seems to depend upon some ethical value, for example, telling the truth. And so to not care for ethics at all is ultimately to undermine one's own profession. The Waiting to Explode case was an example of lying or deceptive information presentation. And repeated acts like this are likely tied to a decrease in an individual's confidence in the media and ultimately regarding what the media is doing as something other than journalism. Finally, journalists can be said to care about not harming people. This is a reasonable assumption. But unethical behavior can harm people, and so journalists should care at least indirectly about being ethical. The McMartin Preschool case was an example of how sensationalist and irresponsible journalism can harm people both financially and psychologically.